Okay, Dr. Matthew J. Trom here. This asynchronous lecture is within the creative ideation module of the 4501 course, and the topic is the hedgehog concept. Now, I've mentioned before that creative ideation module is probably the most important and interesting module in the class, at least with respect to development of your design projects. And at least among the asynchronous lectures, this hedgehog concept lecture is the most important of all of the creative ideation lectures. And so in a way, it's probably not too large a step to say that this particular lecture is at least among the asynchronous lectures, the most important in the class, and we'll see why in a little bit. So, what ultimately we're going to achieve over the span of the lecture is a description and discussion of this thing called the hedgehog concept, which, as we'll see, is sort of an overarching idea that helps to define your project, your major design project, and can influence your design decisions and also influence kind of how you spin and sell and market your idea to, for example, the customers or the engineering panel at the end of class. So as I always try to do, I'm going to start out by talking about where this particular lecture fits into the overall design process. We'll give a little bit of hedgehog concept background. I'm going to describe to you something called the Stockdale Paradox, which we'll return to at the end of the presentation. I'm going to explain kind of what the hedgehog concept is. It's more than just a strategy, as we'll see, and then dig really deep into the definition of the hedgehog concept and the three circles. So we'll talk about what are you best at, what are you passionate about, what drives your economic engine, and then ultimately we're going to talk about Lagoy's corollary to the Stockdale Paradox. So Benny Lagoy was a former EML4501 teaching assistant who now works out in industry. But we'll wrap things up. We'll sort of start almost with the Stockdale Paradox, then we'll wrap up with kind of a corollary to that paradox. But let's just start from the very beginning and talk about where the hedgehog concept fits in to the overall design process. So here is the engineering design process map that you are so used to seeing. And really where we are now, we've marched through all of the initial 5 steps, and we should be right up against the deadline for the CDR, for the concept design report. I've mentioned in class that in the real world, the concept design report takes the form of a meeting between the design engineer, at least in the real world, between the design engineer and the customer, where all of the subsystems that you've come up with as the design engineer, and then a lot of the concepts that populate each of those subsystems are shared with the customer, and the customer either gives their go ahead to start the down selection process, which is moving through yes in this decision bubble, or the customer says, well, I don't really like the ideas that you've given me, and you need to go back and generate some more. And so that sort of sends you in the chutes and ladders mode back down to step 4, which is concept generation, to think about that process again and develop a richer more diverse, more divergent set of ideas to represent the design space. And so the reason that the hedgehog concept kind of sits in the concept design review phase is because this is the beginning of the genesis of the idea that you are going to use as basically the skeleton to build up your design ideas based on what the down selection matrix tells you. And so ultimately the hedgehog concept informs the decision matrix and all of the other decisions that you're going to make basically from here on out throughout the entire project. And so that's kind of why it sits here. in concept design review, step number 6 of the overall process. So that's where we are in our design process. So let me introduce the hedgehog concept to you. It came from a book called Good to Great by Jim Collins, Professor Jim Collins, who is a professor at Stanford University in their School of Business. And this book, Good to Great, was published in 2001. It was on the bestseller list, got an enormous amount of readers. And basically, what it did was describe how companies transition from being just good companies to being great companies, and also gave some explanations as to why most companies fail to make the transition from good to great, hence the title of the book. So because he is an academic and a business professor, Collins actually defines greatness very quantitatively. And in a nutshell, a company that has achieved greatness is a company that has achieved financial performance that's several multiples better than the market average over a time period of at least 15 years. So a very long, protracted time period of exceptional financial performance on the part of a company puts it in this category of a company that demonstrated greatness. And so Jim Collins, the professor who wrote this book, looks at a series in the book, looks at a series of different companies that achieved greatness in kind of different modern time periods, but some earlier, some later, some now. And so that's effectively what we're looking at is this grouping of companies that have achieved this really impressive financial performance. And then, just to point out that the hedgehog concept is not the end all be all gospel of good to great. It's actually one of 7 characteristics of a great company. So it's just one facet, but because we are thinking a lot about kind of new product development and potentially founding companies, and thinking about how to differentiate our product in the design course from other competing projects from other teams, good to great seems like a really relevant thing to talk about right at this particular moment. Because this is basically the situation you guys are in. You're in a highly competitive environment, and good to great will give you some tips on kind of how to claw your way to the top of that environment and get noticed by the people who make the decisions about whether your design is good or not. Okay, so let's transition then to the Stockdale Paradox. Little bit of background here. James Stockdale was a vice presidential candidate. This is probably well before most of your times, but I was in high school when Stockdale was a vice presidential candidate. He ran on the Reform Party ticket, so he was neither a Republican nor a Democrat. He was a third party candidate, and the presidential candidate on that ticket in '92 was Ross Perot. So you might at least know that name from kind of study of late 20th century American history. But we see here the 1992 vice presidential candidate debate, and James Stockdale and Ross Perot had acquired enough of a following, enough signatures in various states that they were actually true contenders, a true third-party contender for the presidency. And so here's Stockdale, at the debate, and then of course here's Dan Quayle, who was the vice presidential candidate and the vice president under George Bush, the original George Bush. And then here is Al Gore, who was the vice president under Clinton, Bill Clinton. And, just a little bit of sort of historical tidbit here. Perot and Stockdale and the Reform Party were thought to have been kind of more conservative than liberal, and ended up kind of splitting the conservative vote and causing George Bush, the original, to not win re-election to the presidency. And so Quayle and Bush ended up not winning, and that paved the way for Clinton and Gore to assume the presidency and the vice presidency um, in 1992. So anyway, here's the vice presidential debate. Now, interestingly, Stockdale, before he was a vice presidential political candidate in the United States, he was in the military. So he held the title of admiral, and Admiral Stockdale was a prisoner of war for a period of time in um, the Korean War. And so in Good to Great, Jim Collins evokes what he calls the Stockdale Paradox, which is named, of course, after James Stockdale. And he puts the Stockdale Paradox in the context of awareness of the difficulty in creating a viable hedgehog concept. So this process that we're about to walk through in this presentation is not necessarily an easy process, and Jim Collins, the author of Good to Great, recognizes that, and just sort of sets you up to be aware that this thing that you're about to do, this concept that you're about to generate, is a very difficult process to walk through. And so here's a quote right from Admiral Stockdale. And this refers to the period of time when he was a prisoner of war. And it says, "You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be." So the ultimate crux of this paradox is, even though at the moment you are in hell, right? And I fully recognize, if you're watching this video, you're right at the end of the concept design report. You have a pretty big mountain left to climb in front of you with respect to completing the design project in 4501. You guys are effectively in hell right now, and I know that, and I recognize that. And that's why I think it's important to describe the hedgehog concept in the context of the Stockdale Paradox. So you guys are, right now confronting the brutal facts of your current reality, which is you got this really hard project in front of you. But what Stockdale says, and this again comes from his prisoner of war experience, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you cannot afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the brutal facts of your current situation. So, in other words, even though you're in hell at the moment, if you guys invest the right amount of time and effort and teamwork and creativity, you will ultimately prevail and come up with a great hedgehog concept and an amazing design that wows the customer, wows the engineering panel, and ultimately proves to be wildly successful. So just never, lose sight of that. Okay, so that's the Stockdale Paradox. Let's transition now into introducing what the hedgehog concept actually is. And most importantly, it's more than just a strategy. It has kind of a deeper elements. But why is this thing even called the hedgehog concept? Well, in Good to Great by Jim Collins, he describes the difference between a cunning fox and a very sort of instinct driven hedgehog, I'll put it that way. So the fox is very energetic, very clever, very business savvy. And every time he tries to attack the hedgehog, what does the hedgehog do? Well, just instinctively, the hedgehog just curls up into a little ball, and his spiny, pointy hedgehog spines stick out from all directions. And there's nothing that the fox can do to attack the hedgehog in any way that's not going to cause the fox significant harm. And so this becomes sort of an analogy for a company making a transition from good to great, in that the hedgehog concept is kind of the protective stance that a company will take in all situations. So it's something the company does all the time in order to preserve itself and preserve its success. And so right out of Jim Collins's book, He says every time a predator attacks, the hedgehog rolls into a defensive spiky sphere. It successfully defends itself by being the best at executing one clear and simple technique. So that's what we mean by a hedgehog concept, being the best at executing one clear and simple technique. And trying to figure out what that technique is the hard part, right? That's the process that you have to kind of muddle through following the Stockdale Paradox, which again recognizes that at the moment you are in hell. But if you invest enough time in this process, you will emerge with a successful hedgehog concept. So let's talk about some of the differences between a hedgehog concept and just conventional strategy. So a hedgehog concept is of course more than just a conventional strategy, and that's because it contains three unique attributes. So first is a hedgehog concept is simple, right? So simple ideas defeat complex ideas in the business world of generating hedgehog concepts. Second, hedgehog concepts are characterized by deep understanding of the three circles, which we will talk about in a second. And then third, a group in 4501 or a company has to have the discipline to comply with its own hedgehog concept once it's established. So this is actually quite hard because hedgehog concepts in a lot of cases sort of constrain like what would be a logical response to particular attack on a company. But remember, the hedgehog just curls up in a ball, assumes a defensive position, and does that same thing over and over and over again, and does it really well. And if your team or your company can stick to that philosophy, you can be wildly successful in both this design process and other design processes as you guys move out into the real world and become practicing engineers. So I've already sort of mentioned this, but a hedgehog concept is also essential to facilitating great engineering design. And most importantly for us, as we sort of leave the concept design report and move into the preliminary design report, a hedgehog concept is useful for making design decisions. So you wonder why, why is Strom talking about this now? Well, it's because we're making that transition from CDR to PDR, and PDR is where you do the decision matrix, where you actually carry out the down selection and allow the decision matrices to tell you which concepts are going to emerge successful and suggested for prototyping to address the customer needs associated with each one of the subsystems that you guys have defined from the customer metrics. So having a hedgehog concept that defines your team, defines your company, defines what it is that you're going to do as you make decisions that influence the design of this part or of this entire product. That's a key thing that's going to govern a lot of your decisions, is actually having a hedgehog concept. So that's why I talk about it now. Okay. So I'm going to pause here and give you guys a little bit of a break. But when we come back from the break, we'll talk about the three circles of the hedgehog concept Venn diagram. And then we will ultimately wrap up with Benny Ligoy's corollary to the Stockdale Paradox, which of course is relevant to you guys as 4501 students. So go take a break, grab a snack. After you've had a little bit of relaxation, come back and we will finish the lecture. Okay, talk to you soon.